Hello, I'm Virginia Prescott, host of On Second Thought from Georgia Public Broadcasting. Thank you for joining our live stream for the Well-Beings Tour. Well-Beings is a national campaign from public media focusing on youth mental health created by WETA. We are grateful to the partners who've committed to helping youth through this initiative. Today's GPB event, Supporting Youth Mental Health, Are Georgia Schools Ready?, is co-produced with Call to Mind. That's an initiative from American Public Media to foster new conversations about mental health. We have an insightful panel of mental health professionals who are working with Georgia's young people and working in schools, just waiting in the virtual wings for our conversation. And we need your questions, your ideas, and your concerns about student mental health in the upcoming school year, which, due to COVID-19 response, will at least begin virtually in many Georgia school districts. So please start typing your questions or comments into the Q&A at the bottom of your webinar screen on the Zoom, or comment in the live stream on the GPB Facebook page. You can use your first name or be anonymous, but please do include your location and your relationship to school. For example, a seventh grader or a high school senior, a parent, a teacher, a counselor, or an administrator. We'll get to your questions and our live discussion after we hear from Well-Beings and why youth mental health is such a critical topic at this unprecedented time.
Day is long and the night is yours alone. When you're sure you've had enough of this life, hang on. Don't let yourself go, 'cause everybody cries and everybody hurts sometimes. Sometimes everything is wrong. It's time to sing along. When your day is night, hold on, hold on. If you feel like letting go, hold on. If you feel like letting go, hold on.
WETA, with a coalition of partners, welcomes you to the Well-Being's Youth Mental Health Project. Hi, I'm Bill Pullman, and I'm honored to be with you as we launch this national campaign from public media. Well-Beings is a groundbreaking project at a very important point in time. Mental illness disproportionately affects our young people and the most disadvantaged populations among us. The growing mental health movement has set the stage for dramatic change, to raise awareness, to reduce stigma, to focus on prevention and early intervention, and the promise of more research for new treatments. Together, we can bring mental illness and discrimination out of the shadows, and it's not a day too soon. So thank you for being here today.
The signature documentary series in the Well-Beings campaign is Ken Burns Presents Hiding in Plain Sight, Our Mental Health Crisis. Produced and directed by Ieps Brothers Productions and written by David Blistein, the film will explore, through lived experiences, the youth mental health crisis in our country. Currently in production, this 4-hour documentary film is slated to air on PBS stations in spring 2022.
Wellbeings.org and hashtag Wellbeings will be adding content every week over the 2 years, including Brave Teens, where teen storytellers go on the record about their mental health journeys.
And Brave High, a digital feature-length documentary where students in high school productions share their mental health stories through spoken word, music, and dance without fear, shame, or stigma.
Out of the Dark, a short-form digital series that will profile lives transformed by mental health challenges, highlighting the power of difference.
PBS NewsHour's student reporting labs engage high school journalism students as correspondents that report on youth mental health from more than 150 high schools across 46 states.
It's time to change the conversation about mental health.
When you know something is wrong,
when you feel alone, when you can't explain what hurts,
when every day is a struggle,
when you can't ask for help,
when your friend or family member seems fine on the outside
but hurts on the inside. Sometimes I feel as though I'm the only one that feels, but I know that's not true.
We can change.
We can change. We can change.
We can make a difference.
There's power in our difference.
we can support each other.
We can fight stigma.
We say it's okay.
It's okay.
It's okay to have a mental health condition.
We all want to feel heard.
To find hope.
And to live in a world without stigma.
Without discrimination.
And we are a force to be reckoned with.
I am not what happened to me.
I am how I overcame it.
Stand with us.
And discrimination in mental health.
You can see the person, not the condition.
You can build understanding.
You can play your part.
The conversation changes with me.
With me.
With me.
We are well-beings.
We are all well-beings.
Good afternoon, I'm Ken Burns. People have often asked me why, after more than 40 years of making films strictly about American history, would I executive produce documentaries on subjects like cancer and genetics, and now youth mental health. Why? Many of our films have, in their own way, dealt with mental health issues. Abraham Lincoln was severely depressed. Meriwether Lewis of Lewis and Clark was bipolar. And of course, many tens of thousands of veterans of the Civil War, World War I and II, and Vietnam have suffered from PTSD and other health challenges. Today, our country is experiencing a mental health crisis, so the topic has to be confronted head on. This collaboration between America's leading brain and mental health advocates, foundations, corporations, and philanthropists, this great production team, and of course PBS, can make a major contribution to raising awareness about this issue, and in the process give hope to countless people who have been reluctant, if not afraid, to ask for help. As a society, we continue to test the resiliency of youth without truly understanding how the stresses of today, including these unprecedented times, are impacting them. We've set out to listen to and to learn from America's young people, documenting their experiences, but also listening to how they are identifying new ways to address mental health challenges. It is a remarkable journey that we hope will capture the unique voices of these young people as they navigate an extraordinarily difficult moment in our country's history. We're very happy to share some early interview footage from this film in production. Thank you so much for your support of this important project.
The only thing I know how to do is to share my own story and my own experience. I can't tell anyone what they can't see for themselves, but I can tell them what it was like for me, what happened to me, and what it's like now that I have recognized my own illness.
It was something in the back of my head, really. It was something that I didn't really worry about.
My dad was an alcoholic, and just like the anxiety of him coming home at night.
It's a strange thing to look back on and think to myself, I really didn't care about anything at that point.
I remember a lot of nights where I would sit in my bed and cry, like for hours after hours.
I felt a lot of pain inside, and I couldn't explain that. I couldn't relay that to other people outside.
The feeling is like walking through, it's like being pulled down, being pulled into like quicksand.
It affects my daily life all day, every day.
To go to school, you know, you put on a face, a facade, you're happy, you're bubbly, and then you eat lunch alone in the bathroom.
I started to self-harm. I learned it in a book that I read.
I'm tired of the voices. I'm tired of everybody labeling me and saying that I'm crazy.
What happens to people with a serious mental illness is that, just like a serious cancer, it begins to metastasize. It turns into disability.
I remember waking up and being in the psych ward and being like, what am I doing here? I had a very high opinion of myself.
It gets complicated by substance abuse.
Drugs and alcohol worked very well for me because they took that anxiety that I had and that sense of isolation, and they eliminated those things.
Drugs and drinking, and that was kind of my excuse, like that outside excuse to match up that feeling of powerlessness inside.
When I finally did like start to think like, oh, I'm probably an addict, I was like, no, like you're just lying to yourself, you know?
When the suicide rate goes up, nobody even knows about it.
I still had a whole future that I had planned, you know. It's like I was planning the suicide, but at the same time, you know, I was making plans to like go out to the movies with my friends next week.
My life was gonna end one way, and that was being addicted to drugs, so why not start now?
Like I wasn't meant to be on this earth.
Long sleeves, no one knew what was on my wrist.
It was actually on social media. These boys were harassing me about something I did. I like couldn't deal with it anymore. Yeah, I actually went through with it. I actually tried to hurt myself.
Those are the moments where I have the best opportunity to plant a seed in someone else's mind. The fact of the matter is, if you don't show some vulnerability, if you don't speak honestly, then there's no truth. And if there's no truth, there's no connection.
It's taken me a very, very long time to even speak openly about it. I think there's a lot of pressure in being vulnerable, especially now with social media and everyone judging you. My roommates don't even know half of this stuff that I'm telling you guys now. And I'm nervous, like I'm kind of shaking inside to even talk about it. But if I can even reach 2 people from everything I say or this story, then I did my part in this world.
We don't understand how common it is. We don't understand how important it is to talk about it and be open about it. So this is the problem that we all deal with in secret. And the result is that we don't deal with it well.
We're back, and thank you for being here to talk head-on about some of the critical questions that we just heard about. Supporting youth mental health, Are Georgia Schools Ready? Is a live conversation. We're also recording this event for radio broadcast on Second Thought this Friday at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. And we want you to be involved in real time. You can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom webinar screen and send your questions to our experts or comment on GPB's live Facebook stream at gpb.org on Facebook. We see your questions are coming in now, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. Please do give us your location and tell us your relation to the school. Are you a parent, a student, a teacher, a school staff, and maybe the age or grade of children that you are working with, or if you are a student. We will use your first name unless you ask us to keep it anonymous. All right, let's get into why we are all here, because this back-to-school season is unlike any in our lifetimes. COVID-19 has put government and education leaders at odds in Georgia and across the country. And the questions over whether or not in-person, virtual, or some hybrid of the two is best and the safest choice for educating our students this coming school year. It is an urgent debate that's been settled in many districts. Still, the resulting anxiety and confusion for students and parents and administrators compounds months of disruption and isolation and insecurity. Access to mental health care and resources for youth was a concern in Georgia even before the pandemic. Well, now some providers predict that things will get worse as students transition back to school. So today we are asking, are Georgia schools ready, prepared to support student mental health under these circumstances? We've got some experienced original thinkers here to talk through some of those challenges and ideas for how to support youth well-being while going back to school in whichever format. I'm joined now by Dr. Erica Fenner-Sitkov. She's Executive Director of Voices for Georgia's Children. She's also a clinical psychologist with experience in school district administration. Erica, are you with us?
Hi.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you so much for your time and for being here. Also with us is Dr. Sarah Vincent. She's founder of the Loria Psych Group and Associate Clinical Professor of Psychiatry and Pediatrics at Morehouse School of Medicine. She's also on the board of the Georgia chapter of the National Alliance on Mental Illness, or NAMI. Sarah, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for bringing attention to this.
Well, I am glad to have this conversation with you all. Dr. Roy Reese is also with us. He's psychologist and director of behavioral health at Acoma Counseling and Consulting. He's associate professor and director of the Smart and Secure Children Parent Leadership Program at Morehouse School of Medicine. Roy, Dr. Reese, thank you so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, so we know thousands of school districts in a state that is already 47th out of 50th in access to mental health for the general population. Jill in Atlanta asks, what were schools doing before the pandemic to support mental health? Erica, I wonder if I could put that to you. Give us a picture of youth mental health support before COVID-19.
Sure. It had a wide variety of resources. Some school districts had, well, to start, we have more than 180 school districts in our state, and along with that comes a wide variety of supports and services. Some schools have partnered with community-based providers to implement more comprehensive school-based services where we have providers in the schools providing services to youth. Other school districts have trained their teachers and their counselors in order to identify needs early and refer them to services outside of the school setting. And some, quite honestly, don't have much in the way of supports at all. They're really at the very beginning of this and recognizing the need and developing partnerships and putting services in place.
Yeah. So we do have the APEX program. This is a school-based mental health program. How is the reach of that? It's been 5 years since the initiation. How far has it penetrated in Georgia schools?
The Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities about 5 years ago started a pilot program where they gave grants to community-based providers to develop partnerships with schools to provide services where kids are every day in their schools. That program now is in nearly 500 schools across the state. So it's grown considerably over the course of 5 years, but we still have a long way to go to make sure there's a school-based mental health program in every school in Georgia.
Especially given that we're not sure what the state of school learning is going to be for a lot of students. Sarah, we know that job loss, housing, food insecurity can trigger depression and anxiety in adults. How do these COVID-19 associated stressors for parents and caregivers affect students?
So kids do, as well as the families and the societies they're in often. They're not separate entities, and sometimes they can be the canary in the coal mine, where they may be more outwardly symptomatic, but when you look at the family, when you look at the family stressors and the things that the family's going through, it may be that they're the one who's most overtly affected, but once you start asking questions, you find out that the whole family unit is stressed.
Mm-hmm. So the treatment plan has to accommodate the whole family on some level.
It has to accommodate the whole family, and it also has to take into consideration these really basic needs and the reality that a lot of families are up against not having those needs met.
So Roy, I know you're still speaking with patients. How is the stress of COVID-19 manifesting in students physically, mentally, emotionally, and what kind of reactions are you seeing from them?
So one of the things that we've seen is that we have seen a significant influx of patients presenting with increased anxiety symptoms and depression symptoms. And we're seeing this among young people. I think that one of the things that happened is that as we were talking about the impact of COVID with respect to morbidity and mortality, that one of the morbidities that we've not paid close attention to is as it relates to mental illness. And a lot of young people are struggling now. On the positive side, that a number of these young people are reaching out to their parents and saying, hey, I need help. I'm struggling with what's going on. But unfortunately, we know that a number of other young people are struggling in silence. One, because they may not have a sense of agency where they can share those concerns with a parent or a trusted other, or where even if they do share, that the access to behavioral health providers may be there. And so some of the things that we're seeing significant impairments in sleep. We're seeing disruptions in diet. We're seeing increased isolation, not just as a function of being isolated, but also as a function of the ways in which the anxiety and the depression is showing up in the lives of these young people.
Yeah, we've got a number of questions here about isolation and its effects. Elizabeth from Adairsville, Gabby, both ask about the impact on mental health. Maybe start with you, Erica. How does this affect different age groups?
Well, it impacts different age groups in many different ways. For very young children, as Sarah, Dr. Vincent noted, all kids respond to how their parents are doing as well, and how the stress in their household and in their community. So for very young kids, they don't have necessarily the verbal skills and all of the tools to be able to express themselves. So you might see young children who have been potty trained regressing some, or acting out their behavior in ways becoming more aggressive that you hadn't seen in a long time, having more tantrums. And in school age kids, really any change in the way that they typically react is a signal for parents to probe a little bit more, make sure they have intentional time with their kids to be able to connect and ask questions about how they're doing. So if you have an extrovert and a child who likes to be around other people and they're not able to do that now, and you see them withdrawing, not coming out from their room, that's a signal and a sign. And all of that is pretty much to be expected. There's a major change in their environment and their structure and their routine that you're going to see some changes in their behavior. But really, when you just see them acting dramatically differently is a signal to probe further and to talk with them further and make the time to do that.
Nuri asks, what are the best strategies to use with middle school students? Sometimes they're shy about their feelings, especially boys. I'm a mother and an educator. Erica, you were talking about just reading signs, especially from young kids. What are some of the signs that parents should be looking out for?
Extreme isolation, not willing to talk at all. Really a major change and shift in personality and the way in which they interact and respond to their parents or their friends. I think, most parents know their kids relatively well, and they can have a gut reaction when they see something change in the shift in their mood or the way that they're responding to them or their friends. So anytime you notice that change is an opportunity to engage in a conversation with them.
Roy, as somebody who's treating kids of this age, what do you think about Nuri's question for specifically middle school kids?
So the part of the question that I responded to is the question about boys. And I think that there are differences in the ways in which anxiety and other mood disorders, other disruptive challenges manifest in young people, but there are also gender differences. And I think it's important to pay attention to that. And so sometimes the externalizing behaviors that we see in boys and male adolescents sometimes get confused as disruptive behavior versus being understood that they may indicate that this person is struggling with a mood disorder, anxiety or depression. And so we understand that asking the right question is key to making the right diagnosis. And the ways in which we understand boys and girls needs to reflect that. And I think there are gender differences. I think that across multiple identities that those also could be different manifestations in terms of how that shows up. And so we want to be careful. And one of the things we really want to support parents doing is that when they're not sure to ask questions, oftentimes the first line of defense around that is the primary care pediatrician. Hey, this is going on with my son or with my daughter. I'm not really sure what's happening here, and to kind of do some problem solving in terms of like, hey, let's figure this out. Do we need to get some other professionals involved?
Mm-hmm. So access is a question that we will certainly get to, but I want to just pick up on that piece because I'm also reading that a lot of people who are frontline medical, who are not necessarily on the COVID, treating patients with COVID-19, are not actually as busy as they used to be. So this actually could be a very ideal time to reach out to your pediatrician.
So, one of the things that we struggle with is that we haven't done a great job of connecting dots. So, for example, in my way of thinking about health, I think about the intersection of physical health and behavioral health or mental health. And that if we're talking about promoting wellness in young people, that we should really be thinking about how we think about primary care as it relates to both mental health and physical health. And so with people who are young people who have a medical home, which is a problem in the state of Georgia, but for those people who do have a medical home, that one of the things that we want to be thinking about is, hey, we want those PCPs to be asking questions. Hey, how are they doing with respect to their adjustment as it relates to the pandemic, not being able to interact with their peers, being isolated at home? Do they have concerns as they think about the return to school? And frankly, and I forget whether it was Sarah or Erica who mentioned this before, we also want to think about how's the family doing? How are you managing these concerns? Because that piece about as the parents go, so go their kids is a very real thing.
Yeah. Sarah Vinson, the virus is now affecting more people in their teens and 20s, especially in the South and the West of the United States. This is a highly social cohort, but at the same time, their ability to make risk calculations is still very much in development. So can you address that, some of the concerns of that age group?
Yeah, and so as we see this affect younger and younger people, there's growing concern about what this is going to do physically, while we're still trying to balance the drawback of having people isolated at this really social time. And so one of the things that I've encouraged families that I work with to do is be really intentional about scheduling time and scheduling activities in a safe way. And that can be socially distant walks or meetups, or even with some kids who may be in middle school, sort of scheduling time to do FaceTime, because they do need that social interaction, and we don't want to deprive people of that, but we need to do it in a way that sort of takes into account the bigger picture.
Yeah, and as we heard, the social connection is one of the big ways that we can help people get through mental health crises or even the first signs of mental health. So let's look at students, what's going on this year. Across the country, some districts do report high truancy rate, and students actually falling off the radar since classrooms went virtual. Erica, do you have ideas of numbers here in Georgia of students who have just not logged on or have gone missing since virtual learning began?
No, unfortunately, we don't have a statewide number for that. And I encourage our state to collect that data so that we can get a much better handle on that as school begins and be able to deploy resources as needed. We have had some individual reports from conversations we've had with some schools that have said upwards of 60% of their kids they haven't had contact with or regular contact with since March. And if you see that as a leading indicator to what's happening across the state, and I think it is for many families who don't have reliable or any internet access, or who are managing really overwhelming circumstances with regard to parental employment and lack of childcare. We're going to see a lot of that over the next month as schools reopen, and it's more critical than ever that we have an all hands on deck approach to this, that we look at every state agency and all the resources in our communities, from after school programs to child care centers to pediatricians, that we really develop a community-wide collaboration to do well checks on families.
So I've got a question here from an anonymous attendee who says, in small towns in Georgia with a UGA presence, the communities are going to receive an influx of 10 to 20,000 students at the same time public school resumes. Who's coordinating the public health risk of this perfect storm? You know, this is a place in many parts of Georgia, small hospitals, minimal public health presence, Valdosta, Statesboro, that kind of place. So maybe we can lift this question to who is coordinating this for students. We're getting messages from the Department of Education in Georgia, individual school districts, locals. There's all sorts of confusion and waffling about that. How does that kind of confusion affect students?
Significantly. I mean, children thrive on stability, and really parents do as well, families, everyone thrives on stability, but young people really thrive on stability and predictability. And we just have none of that right now. I mean, it's changing on a week-to-week basis. We had some school districts originally come out with plans that said, we're giving families a choice, virtual and in person. And then within 2 weeks, that's changed to 100% virtual. That doesn't instill a lot of confidence in young people about being able to predict what's going to come next in a fundamental aspect of their daily lives. To the question of who's coordinating it, it really looks different in each community. Every school district, like I said, we have more than 180 of them across the state, makes their own decision. And we have local public health departments, local family child service agencies that are going to need to come together to support their communities.
We did get a statement from the Georgia Department of Education. They have a mental health and wellness working group composed of staff, district and school support services, counseling, social work staff, parent representatives, nonprofit partners. So they've created some guidance for that. We will post a link to that on our page. But I'm wondering, Sarah Vincent, for you, what are you seeing here? This level of coordination between schools, and what does that mean for students who are, especially somebody who's really anxious about contracting the virus or infecting somebody else?
Actually, one of the conversations I had with one of my patients today was how anxiety provoking it feels to not have faith in the people in charge and to not know sort of how they're making decisions or feel as if they're communicating with you clearly. And so I think something that could be done from the top down is just more communication, even if we're not exactly sure what's going to happen, to let people know sort of how we're thinking, what we're taking into account, and where things are. But it certainly is really, really difficult for people. Just this transition back to school can be anxiety provoking in and of itself. And now you have COVID and all these things on top of it. And particularly for students who are heading into their senior years or heading into some other big transition point, this has caused a lot of worry and fear.
Roy, what are you hearing from your students or patients, rather, clients who are feeling anxious about going back to school?
Well, I think that Sarah and Erica have kind of captured it in terms of the questions that have yet to be answered. And I think that one of the things that we frankly have not done is to acknowledge what we don't know. None of us in our lifetime have experienced a pandemic of this magnitude that's impacted us as broadly as this has. None of us have seen something that has impacted schools, jobs, the economy, and our sense of security. And so I think one of the things that's important is to say we're figuring it out as we go. And so part of that, and I think New York presented a good example in terms of their state leadership, is like, hey, here's where we are, here's what we know, here's what we don't know, and here's what we're trying to figure out. I think it's, well, they're working on it. They're acknowledging that it's a problem. They've brought the right people to the table, or who they think are the right people to the table. And those folks were talking, and they're sharing information as transparently as they can. I think people do well with information, even if that information is hard to digest. And so as people deal with the anxiety of like, how do I send my kid, or if I'm the kid, how do I go to school, stay safe, get an education, and manage the associated stress that goes along with that. I think when you have information, hey, this is where we are today, and where we might be where we might be a week from now might be somewhat different. So I think it's important to acknowledge what we don't know, champion what we do know in terms of what we have confidence in, and says we're going to figure this out together because we're all in this together. I think that's a really important message.
Anonymous question here. What do you do when the children are afraid to go back? You know, Mom, what if I infect my friend and she dies? How can we comfort kids?
So, you know, with respect to that, I don't think we did a great job. And again, I think this goes back to what we know and what we don't know. And I think, you know, the reality is in the state of Georgia, in the space of pediatric behavioral health and mental health, we have a number of problems with regard to how robustly we address and promote positive behavioral health, as well as the availability of providers. And so we didn't do a good job normalizing the anxiety that people would understandably have as the pandemic began to grow, and we began to see some of its impacts. And frankly, I don't know that we've done a great job kind of creating opportunities for dialogue. I think these conversations are happening in a number of families, but to that example, about fear is about acknowledging the fear and talking about your own anxiety, and then figuring out like how we're going to cope. And if I'm that parent and I don't know the answers, I'm going to say, you know what, we're going to figure this out together. So I'm going to make some calls. We'll figure out who to talk to, and we're going to figure out what we can do. So one, you don't get COVID. Two, you don't have to worry about either giving it or giving it to somebody. So let's do this together.
So you're talking about what we're hearing is about parental-based solutions for the most part so far. But now if we're going back to school in whatever form, virtual, hybrid, or in person, we're noting now that reporting of domestic violence has been down since COVID, down by half in April. Teachers are trained to spot and mandated to report. Are they trained in these virtual settings? I mean, several people have asked if counselors are monitoring virtual classes for signs of physical and mental well-being. Do you want to pick that up first, Roy? It sounded like you had a response.
I do have a response. And so one, I'm not positive that those rates are actually down. I'm not sure that I agree based on work I do in some other spaces. But I think there are two things here. One, parents are the constant in the lives of kids. And so we have to figure out how we equip them to manage COVID, manage school, and the intersection thereof. The other part of that is, I think we have to recognize that whether you're going back virtually or some combination of virtual and in person, parents were not trained. Most of us are parents were not trained as educators. I've been a professor half my life, and I feel very stressed and challenged around my daughters and how to support them, with respect to their educational goals. And then I think, so we figure out how we support parents in that space, but with regard to how we support teachers, what is the professional development workshop that they're getting or support they're getting for everything from how we implement IEPs and 504 plans virtually to how we identify problems that otherwise, if that student was in the classroom, we would be able to identify. And so we have some real challenges in front of us. And I think that these conversations help us begin to unpack how we get to some answers.
Well, we do have a number of questions about IEPs and how they're being handled. I don't know, Sarah or Erica, do you have any ideas or you want to pick up on that thought?
Yeah, so the abuse piece, Erica mentioned that in some school districts, up to 60% of students hadn't even logged on. That's probably a higher risk population to start with. So a lot of the kids who aren't showing up are maybe the ones where there may be more going on in the household, where there's not as much reliability in terms of their caregivers or access. And so I think the reality is a lot of those people are completely out of teachers' reach right now. When it comes to IEPs, my observation this past semester is that for the most part, they just were not followed or honored. And so students got frustrated. They knew that their grade wasn't going to get worse because most school districts said you can get better, but you're not going to go down. And they just checked out. And so that is something that we know children are going to need. And it is going to be particularly challenging to do in a virtual setting.
Question here from an anonymous attendee. What legal rights will parents of children with IEPs have to justify the online support a child will need to succeed? Is this a wait and see what happens and go from there?
Well, you still have the right to a free and appropriate public education, even if it is virtual learning. And so those rights don't go away. Now, how they are enforced, how long it takes for them to be enforced may change, but you still have all the rights that come with your IEP.
So this is an interesting thing that the Department of Education has said. They have requested for this year a waiver from the federal government of standardizing testing and accountability requirements for the 2021 school year, knowing that students will be dealing with the ongoing effects of global crisis, believing the school's focus belongs on making it through the challenge together, not on the pressure of a high-stakes test. Do you think that there might be a possibility that they will also ask for waivers from honoring IEPs at this time?
I wouldn't be surprised, but I hope that families and communities really lobby to keep those protections in place because they're there for a reason. No one gets an IEP easily. It is quite a process. So if someone has it, it's because there's a need and you want that need to get met. And what I'm concerned about is that the kids who already were on the wrong side of the educational divide have fallen further back in these past few months. And if we don't lobby for them to have the things that we know they need, it's only going to become a greater disparity.
Well, and we're looking at now $950 million cut from the Quality Basic Education Program in FY 2021. Of course, falling tax revenues and down economy is blamed for the budget passing and reductions in it. How is this, America, maybe to you, how is this going to affect funding for school counselors? And where does that put the ratio that legislators were initially aiming for?
It affects it. I mean, not only were those cuts to education, there were also cuts to the Department of Behavioral Health and Developmental Disabilities, so the after-school clubhouses, the Project Apex program. Really, these budget cuts were felt everywhere, and children's mental health and education were no exception to that. With regard to the point made about the abuse and neglect numbers, that is a reduction in reports made. And I think everyone agrees that, if anything, the cases of it have likely risen and not decreased. Right now, the Department of Education is partnering with Prevent Child Abuse Georgia, Georgia Center for Child Advocacy, to do some training with educators across the state of how to pick up on cues online. Some school districts are thinking of, and we're encouraging them to think of ways that children can communicate through their virtual platforms directly with the school counseling office, because it used to be they could pop by the office or fill out a form. That's no longer available. So how can we leverage technology where it's available for students to be able to submit requests or to flag that they're having an issue and they need some help? And then also to think about, again, those partnerships. No one agency, Department of Education, is not going to be able to respond to. Individual school districts are not going to be able to respond to this growing need. We saw when school closed in the spring, the long lines for families to come and access their lunch program. All of that has only been exacerbated by the economic impact that families are feeling. So I just emphasize now more than ever that those partnerships between the different state agencies beyond Department of Education, with their local mental health community providers, their pediatricians, their food banks, to be able to get those needs met for families, and creating a direct line for students to be able to flag that they need those services, versus having to go through their parents, or their parents to have to go through extra steps to try and access them.
Yeah, so this is a question that is really on people's minds. A lot of people from across Georgia are asking about how these disparities are playing into mental health outcomes for youth, whether that's in rural, urban communities, that divide, refugee and immigrant populations, children with special needs, socioeconomic inequities, LGBTQ or trans students, students dealing with racial trauma. Many of these things have been brought up. So there are a number of questions here. Maybe the place to go in. How about with you, Roy? The biggest concerns here, what are the biggest, which populations or groups are most affected by what has been going on? We know that Black and brown people have been ill and more deaths per population from COVID-19. Do you want to pick up on some of how these disparities are actually changing the way that we're thinking about educating, or whether or not there should be some real serious assessment about how to educate kids, either online, in person, or the hybrid model?
So I'm going to take a step back. Thank you. That's an excellent and challenging question.
A very big one too. I'm sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. It's okay. We can't give school systems a pass on educating kids or carrying out the services and the kids are entitled to. And I think it's important, this idea of us, hey, let's just get past or get through the school year, that's part of where this discussion around disparities start. So in under-resourced, underperforming schools, pre-pandemic, right? If we say, you know what, we're really just we're trying to get through this school year. There's been a lot of discussion that's talking about how kids are going to fall behind academically, or how they've already fallen behind academically. And we know that has all kinds of implications for future orientation, the world of work, underemployment, undereducation, etc. And so we have to create a healthy, workable tension between the challenge that school systems are facing and the demands that parents understandably should be making, that their kids both be safe and get a quality education. I think that when we move into the space of understanding these disparities, so this gets into kind of some of the adult issues, and particularly when we start thinking about essential workers. And so Black and brown communities have been disproportionately impacted, both with regard to morbidity and mortality. But it's going to be those parents who are going to be more likely, and those parents coming from poor communities, who are going to have to go to work. So if you go to a school system that's doing virtual education, who's at home helping that student with their studies? What kinds of tensions does that create in the home? What does that mean for the kid's sense of self? So that maybe in a year when we're back, with some sense of relative norm, in-person education, et cetera, how far behind is that student or those students? And so that's the piece that's one of the pieces that we have to begin to address. And so we know that the economic piece shows up here in terms of parents' ability to support their kids, whether that is I can actually be home with my kid, or I have the internet access, the laptop, the iPad, etc., to support my kid doing the virtual education, to them not becoming further behind. And I think we need to lift those pieces up, that if we're really talking about equity, both in health and educational outcomes, that we have to address how we're going to support both parents as they manage this piece, students, and making sure they get what they need so that these disparities don't become more pronounced.
Sarah, I'm going to go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to underscore what Roy said, that, you know, historically, particularly with Black and brown children, we have taken a punitive approach versus a restorative and nurturing approach. Mm-hmm. And now more than ever, when we debate what does attendance look like, you know, historically, it's been punitive when kids don't show up to school and they're truant, versus asking the underlying questions as to why that's happening and what families need in order to help their kids engage. And so now more than ever, we have a moment to meet if we are going to be nurturing and supportive of families and all come together to eradicate the inequities that have long existed, or continue to move forward down the same path of under-resourcing children with special needs, of being punitive when kids are struggling to engage for the obvious reasons. They are struggling to engage for all the things that we've been talking about.
Well, the question is, does that get seen in the same way in a virtual environment or some sort of hybrid when contact with the students is somewhat limited? Maybe to you, Sarah, do you have a sense of which learning option, you know, online, in-person, hybrid, most exacerbates disparities?
So I think in terms of which may most exacerbate it, for some kids in families that don't have the resources or that are particularly chaotic, school is really their refuge. And so by them not being able to go to this place for so many of their waking hours, it really is a significant loss for them. And just to echo what Roy and Erica said about not taking a punitive approach to this applies to the families and in terms of how we're thinking about DFACS involvement, but also children who may have DJJ or Department of Juvenile Justice involvement, that sometimes children may be in violation of their plan if they're not going to school or they're not passing or they're not getting good grades. And so something that we really need to think about is school judicial partnerships and making sure we're not penalizing kids from a juvenile justice standpoint because their needs aren't being met. And this is a situation where we really have to think about the difference between equal and equity and understand that it's entirely predictable which kids at which schools are going to have more of these issues. If you're at a school that has 99% free lunch versus 0.02% free lunch, we know that those schools are going to need more help. So we don't have to sit around and wait or look for some sort of signal through Zoom classes. We already know where the under-resourced schools and communities are. And I think if at all possible, we should be proactive about putting additional resources in place from the beginning, understanding they're going to need extra.
Right. So this is a much larger structural problem, but a number of people are asking about how they can support. You know, Julie wants to know, how are teachers being equipped with social emotional learning tools to engage kids, to make virtual learning more interesting to them?
You know, the resource that you mentioned, Virginia, from the Department of Education, the Wellness Restart Work Group, has gathered a number of resources of strategies that school districts are implementing, and they range from Wellness Fridays to creating that button that kids can click on to reach the school counselor, to additional training of their teachers in order to do, for example, a check-in and check-out at the beginning of each class, how everyone is doing at the beginning, how everyone's doing at the end, and be able to recognize and flag and do individual follow-up directly with children. So there is a pretty wide range of different resources that school districts can tap into to support their teachers in supporting their children and families. So that's a place to start to look at some options and be able to ask your school district. And as a parent, simply asking the question, what are you doing demonstrating that with your voice that this is important to me and to our community. And so I'm asking the question, what are you doing? Not are you doing something, but what are you doing? You need to be doing something, and what is it?
I don't want to lose Sarah's point, however, because I feel like the disparities are such a huge issue in education, as we know, across Georgia. And I've heard accounts from people trying to talk to their children. Let's get to the equality question rather than equity, or about why so many more Black and brown people are getting COVID, or talking about the murder of George Floyd and why people are marching in the streets. Sarah, maybe over to you. Thoughts on how carrying that mental and emotional burden of racial justice and the racial justice movement impacts mental health. We'll start with you.
So we know that racism has negative impacts on mental health. It is a social determinant of health and of mental health. And what we're seeing both when it comes to COVID and when it comes to the deaths of George Floyd and here in Georgia, Ahmaud Arbery, that our society doesn't value and protect Black lives in the way that it values and protects others. And this isn't something that is new to Black children. I think it has been raised in the national conversation in a different way. But this is something that they deal with and that they contend with, whether they have a name for it or not. You know, these kids who are living in these under-resourced communities and these hyper-segregated schools, they are dealing with the ramifications of things like redlining that are the direct results of structural racism. And so this is something that these communities bear and deal with and suffer under on a day-to-day basis. And COVID, to Roy's point about who is essential workers, who's losing their jobs, you know, the disproportionate impact was something we all predicted would come because of greater exposure, but also a higher proportion of pre-existing mental health issues due to those lifestyle issues and the pre-existing problems we have around access in this country that are often around geography and income, which we know have racialized components to them.
Yeah, I want to ask about the geography a little bit. We know that this is a big issue, where people live, whether or not they have internet access, which of course, if they're doing virtual learning programs, there are more Southwest and Southeast Georgia communities who are choosing to do in-person learning or some hybrid. And those are often areas, but not exclusively, most affected by lack of internet penetration. Roy, I think you had an example of some community DV shelter that was working to try and bring more access to kids outside of, I'm not sure if it was in Atlanta or not. Could you go through that with us?
I remember.
It's the camp kids.
Right, Camp Peace. Thank you. So I have a relationship with the Women's Resource Center here in Atlanta, which is a agency that focuses on domestic violence, and they work with kids who are impacted by domestic violence. And one of the things that they did to support families and kids is to engage. So for example, one of the things that we know is that this summer was atypical as compared to summers past. Kids aren't going to summer camps, etc. And so what they did is they created virtual learning to promote social and emotional learning for the kids, to support parents in terms of stress management and conflict management, in terms of how to kind of parent in a more stressful living environment. But they're also then looking at how they engage with schools and other partners to say, how do we create systems of care that extend across settings? And this goes to some of what Sarah was saying around the systemic piece, but creating systems of care that cut across families, cut across schools, cut across health, cut across economic considerations, to make sure as best we can that schools, that families are whole, that kids are whole, and that we have places where we can identify kids who may be in need. So Erica was talking about how the kid who otherwise might have said something to a school counselor, but thinking about Camp Peace and some of its objectives, that provides an opportunity where they very explicitly, like, hey, if this is happening and if you're struggling with this, here are some things that you can do in terms of talking to staff from Camp Peace, as well as creating opportunities to do check-in with families to say, hey, we know there have been challenges in this space in the past. Just being realistic, how are we doing? and what support can we place? And then one of the things that we've done or that we're thinking about how we expand is creating telehealth or telemental health kind of resources for these folks to be able to have access to people like us to get the support that they need.
Telehealth is actually something that has been in operation in many parts of Georgia for some time. It's less difficult here than in other parts of the country, certainly. I'm not sure about, there was some question about whether insurance was paying for it. Has that shifted at all? Does anybody know during the COVID-19 or the pandemic and that response?
So insurance companies have had actually a fairly uniform approach. Very early in the pandemic, we saw insurance companies relax their telehealth kind of requirements, that if they had certain protocols that you had to follow prior to the pandemic, they relaxed those. We saw insurance companies where, for example, there may have been a co-payment involved in the provision of services that a number of insurance companies eliminated that so that families didn't have to worry about providing co-payments, recognizing the negative economic impact of COVID on the overall economy. And so frankly, I've been positively encouraged by the steps that the insurance industry, particularly in the behavioral health space, has taken around that. I don't know if my colleagues have had similar or dissimilar experiences.
Anyone, I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I'm also wondering about, what happens in school districts where virtual learning is not an option for students without internet. In Oglethorpe County, east of Athens, Superintendent Beverly Levine said that after the schools went virtual, they were able to put a device in every single kid's hands, but that did not solve the problem because they didn't actually have access to the internet. So Erica, putting a device in everyone's hand should help. There are a lot of families with many kids and they may not all have their own devices, but is there any larger structural solution being proposed for internet connectivity, especially for kids at this time?
This pandemic has magnified these gaps and fragility in our systems that have long existed. The disparities that have long existed in resources and opportunity, and broadband is just one of them. What systemically, with regard to broadband, they are now publishing and bringing to light where those gaps exist. I know that there are conversations happening to figure out how to bring internet to places where those gaps are. But it's going to take a tremendous amount of resources to really comprehensively think about what is needed to fully have equity and access. And broadband is a piece of it. But you also mentioned everybody having a device so that all children are able to log in and have access to their teachers and the supports when they're supposed to, versus getting, again, dinged or having a punitive outcome because they hadn't logged in. So really thinking through all of the different aspects of supports that families need, and broadband being a very big piece of that, necessary but not sufficient to fully meet the access demands.
So how about the status of creating trauma-informed care for student-based mental health in Georgia? As many as 70% of Georgia children fall somewhere on the scale of pre-existing traumas. Could this crisis be creating actual trauma for children? Erica, you want to start with that?
I think it is absolutely creating additional trauma, whether it being exacerbating trauma that already existed because of lack of meeting basic needs, because of violence that they were exposed to before that are exacerbated now due to the systemic and structural impact of racism that Sarah and Roy have talked about as well. All of that existed before. All of that has been exacerbated and maximized during the pandemic. So for those that were already enduring trauma, that has gotten worse. And now we have more children are enduring trauma than didn't before because of the economic impact. Parents who have lost their job, children that are going without food that have never experienced that before, and homelessness being expected to be on the rise. In terms of trauma-informed care, there is a growing movement to have professionals, both mental health professionals as well as educators, really anyone, after school providers working with youth, to be trained in trauma-informed. I think it's really important that how we define trauma and think about it comprehensively to make sure we're catching all the kids that we need to. So we've talked some about what are kids' behaviors really telling us. They could be telling us a myriad of things. And historically, you know, people's first inclination is to make it about that child. There's something wrong with that child versus asking the question of what happened to them. I think that we've made the assumption that mental health and behavioral health specialists automatically get that training, and that isn't the case. Really, everybody needs a good dose of how to be trauma informed in their responsiveness and awareness, and that they're thinking about trauma comprehensively to include the systemic and structural racism that children experience, the trauma they experience of not getting their basic needs met, and how that manifests in their behavior in school and in their community, and making sure that we respond accordingly, versus thinking something is wrong with that child.
Right. And of course, there are a number of different kind of traumas. I'll invite Roy or Sarah to wave if you want to pick up on this, because we have a lot of questions about traumatic situations for refugee immigrant communities, for example, you know, isolated from families abroad, elevated levels oftentimes of previous trauma, language barriers to get access to information. Got a question here. As our community grows in diversity, is it important to be culturally responsive? How can we help parents from other countries overcome stigma of mental health? This is from a mom and an educator. Anyone? Erica, you're nodding, so I'm thinking that may be something you want to talk about.
Oh, I think my colleagues can speak to it very, very well.
Who wants to pick that up? And I think a lot of people are asking questions like, how can we support, you know, even if they're not a member of those communities, how can we support children in foster care? So if in your answer, you could maybe focus it a little bit on how to help support. I don't know, Sarah, Roy,
Sure.
who wants to pick this up?
Yeah.
So one of the things when it comes to helping communities that you may not be part of is respecting who knows that community, who has knowledge of it, and being humble in offering your help. So not assuming that you know what people need or how they need it, but being really intentional about engaging who are the leaders, who are the people in that community that folks already go to, and partnering with those people, and not going in, you know, thinking that you have your cape and you're going to go help this group of folks, but realizing that they already have strengths, they already have resources, and the best thing that you can do is try to support those things that are in place. The other thing I'll say too is, you know, certainly to those who are in a position of leadership, sometimes we can get into this pattern of having like our diversity day once a year or our cultural day once a year. And really when it comes to addressing these things that are so complex and that have so many layers to them, a day of talks isn't really going to do it. It really has to be a matter of looking at how your school is serving certain segments. So for instance, if you notice that no one from refugee or immigrant communities is engaging with your school counselors, then why is that? What do we need to do in terms of outreach? What is it about how we operate? Are people afraid of being reported to ICE if they come talk to us? Asking those questions about how you're set up and how your system may actually be part of perpetuating those issues.
So I could pick up, sure.
Yeah, sure. So
one, if we take a step back, I think we should assume that everybody's been traumatized by what's happening. The pandemic in and of itself is a traumatic, life-altering event, and that cuts across the various intersectionalities that we see as a function of gender or ethnicity or race or gender identity status, LGBTQ, immigrant status, you know, child welfare, etc. And so with that, we understand that this is exacerbated for people who may have already had some pre-existing trauma. I think to the issue of competence culturally around engagement, start with the assumption that we can do better and that we don't know everything. And I think this goes to Sarah's comment about throwing on our cape. I think that that's very important. I find the most instructive piece is a willingness to listen and to learn. People will tell you what they need if you listen, but you have to be willing to set aside your privilege, whether that's as a provider or an educator or somebody who's involved in leadership in the system, that there are a variety of different ways that privilege shows up, and that we have to own that and have to engage in a way that says, you know what, we might not know the best way to do this, because many of the educational disparities in terms of achievement that we have seen prior to the pandemic are really a function of how we engage, how we listen or how we don't listen. And so we've added this additional layer on top. And so we want to humble ourselves to bite what Sarah said, and saying, hey, I want to help. I'm not sure how to help. Here are some of my thoughts. Tell me if any of this is helpful. Tell me what you think might be helpful. Here are some resources I might be able to bring to the table. I think by partnering and working together that we really kind of move the needle. I have been encouraged in that I've seen examples across many communities in my own neighborhood where people are much more present than they have ever been in terms of asking about people. How are you doing? Do you need anything? And so I think sometimes times of trauma and national challenge bring out the best of us. Certainly we have examples where we have seen the worst in some people, but I want to focus on getting it done and helping people. And so I think that when we work with those folks who might be like-minded or certainly trying to figure out how to be like-minded, then we can move this needle in the interest of young people, in the interest of families, and in the interest of those systems that serve them.
And I would encourage us to make sure, and for parents that are asking us what they could do, that include youth in this dialogue. Kids talk to other kids, and kids can be a tremendous resource to one another. And the more we can equip our kids to recognize their own humility and ask their friends questions, or to be inclusive and open to their peers, can go a long way, because they really look to each other, particularly in times of crisis, for that support. And they're looking to each other right now. And the more we can equip our own children, and the more schools as well can equip students to be able to be peer-to-peer resources, is going to be really important to get us through this.
Well, we have a couple of questions about that, how to involve the student voice in what's going on here, instead of speaking to, like some anthropological kind of sample. Paris from Evans wants to know, how can students be involved and know what is happening so they can feel some control? A couple of other questions about, will well-being classes, will wellness classes be part of the curriculum in Georgia? Erica, you're nodding. Do you have any notions on that, how that is being included?
Well, I think again, parents and students should be asking their school district leadership how they are including the voice of students. Are they having, a lot of school districts are having town halls to talk to parents, well, town halls to talk to students and solicit feedback from them about what they need, asking them what they need, and what they'd like to see. So I encourage youth and parents to reach out to their school district leadership to ask these questions and say they want to be heard and provide feedback and want to be in the know. I think some examples of how school districts are doing that, some of them are having, they have designated group of students advisory councils that they regularly listen to and engage with. One, making sure that those advisory councils are diverse and representative of the student body. And two, making sure school districts have them in the first place and have a forum within which they are getting student feedback, and communicating directly with students is key.
I want to make sure we talk about teachers somewhat before we run out of time here. A number of teachers have protested. Some have resigned when a couple of weeks ago, when the federal threat of in-person classes was a little bit more severe. It's now backed off in that somewhat. I know Voices of Georgia's Children has also a reverse course on that somewhat. So how is the mindset or stress of teachers? How is that affecting students in the classroom? Sarah, do you want to answer that?
Sure. So teachers teach, sure, but they're also human beings, and people cannot give what they do not have. And so if they don't feel a sense of power or a sense of agency, it's going to be really hard for them to reinforce that in the children that they're trying to teach and support through these really difficult times. And I really do see teachers as an extension of that family unit we were talking about. When you think about the important adults in a child's life, especially those kids who are with that teacher all day in elementary school, that's a really significant adult for them. And getting back to some of those, equity issues that we raised earlier, we do know that bias plays a role in how kids are disciplined and to what degree they're disciplined. And there are studies that show that when people aren't at their best, when they are stressed, they are more likely to sort of act on those biases, whether it's intentional or not. And so in thinking about student health and mental well-being, we absolutely have to think about teachers because they are part of that core group of people who the children are going to reflect off of.
Erica, I know Voices held a panel discussion on the state of school-based mental health with providers across the state. Was that counselors or did you hear from teachers as well?
Those were counselors that partner with school districts to provide comprehensive school-based mental health in the schools. We also had Department of Education and Department of Developmental Disabilities on that panel as well.
So how about them? I mean, the number of them, from what I read, are volunteering, delivering food and lunches to families and actively helping to manage food and housing insecurity, connecting their students to the resources that they need. Is there, what is the risk of burnout, not just for teachers, but also for counselors who are in that position?
The risk is great for everyone. As we've been leading discussions with regard to how to support youth, just as Sarah was saying, we're also encouraging how do you support teachers. There are hotlines for parents and kids to call, creating some hotlines for teachers to be able to get some support. Secondary trauma is a real thing. When you are taking on the well-being of others, you often put yourself last. And so they are working round the clock to support children and families and meeting their needs and not always putting their own oxygen mask on and making sure that we have those support systems readily available for those providers, which include mental health providers and teachers, all of the above.
Well, the oxygen mask thing has taken on a whole new meaning, has it not, in this crisis? Question here, this is very specific. Colleen asks, how can we convince our district to let the school social workers provide mental health services virtually? She's at the school social worker in Augusta, Georgia. Are there specific schools that are resisting or not able to provide these services for whatever reason they give?
So the majority of the schools that have these mental health partnerships, like I was describing, they really quickly pivoted to doing virtual mental health services. They too realized really quickly those families that don't have broadband or quite frankly don't have enough minutes on their phone to be able to engage, and they started to work aggressively to get those resources to their families. There were some school districts prior to the pandemic that resisted tele, citing privacy concerns, that they didn't feel like the connections were secure. But this pandemic has opened the door to think differently and recognize that that there's great opportunity to increase access through those means. I have not heard of examples where school counselors have started doing that on large scale, but I have heard of school districts that have created the opportunity for their school counselors and their school psychologists to make contact and do outreach either by phone or video chat to make sure there's connectivity with children in need.
So we know Georgia did not have a strong record of supporting student mental health pre-COVID. Some resources going toward there. Now a lot of money cut back from the budget, the school budget, and the Department of Health and Human Services. Now further strained, which feels like the burden is somewhat shifting to teachers, to parents, to families, to students. How about communities? Are there community models, and any of you can raise your hands, any community models that you have seen that have been especially effective at helping students connect with mental health resources or supporting wellness?
Where there are partnerships that currently exist, we highlighted a few of them the other day in Albany, Georgia, North Georgia, Middle Georgia, where there's a strong community collaborative system of care, as Roy noted, where you have communities that have made those connections between the mental health providers, the food services, food banks, and are figuring out ways that they can join forces to meet this needs and connect with families. So there are examples of that throughout the state that we can really look to lift up and provide exemplars for other communities.
Sarah, Roy?
Yeah, so I think, so the exemplars are too far and few between, but I think there also exists the opportunity to create these systems of care in which community-based behavioral health services can be extended in their partnerships with school. One of the things that we know in Georgia is that there is an inadequacy with regard to the availability of adequate numbers of providers to do this work. And so we're at this place where we have a more pronounced need among young people and their families. And so that part of the conversation has to be how we engage those community providers, perhaps folks who are in private practice or in group practices, to say, hey, we have a demonstrated need here. We want to work with you. We need to work with you to service the needs, to be available to our students and families as those needs are identified. It is not reasonable to think that schools have the resources pre-pandemic or now to respond to the breadth and magnitude of need that we know that exists in the school mental health space. So we need to be reaching out both school systems and government, but also providers. So as I think about, the Georgia Psychological Association, I'm sure there's the equivalent with regard to social work and psychiatry, how we extend ourselves, how folks reach out to us to say, hey, how can we work to support students and their families and support teachers? One of the things I thought about the question around teachers and their struggle is that many of those teachers are also parents. And so they're thinking about not only how they support their students, but how they take care of their own kids, what concerns they have around risk mitigation coming back into their own homes. And so we need to be thinking in comprehensive and inclusive ways about how we provide support to folks.
The Georgia Academy of Pediatrics put out a toolkit of how pediatricians can reach out to their school districts and develop partnerships as school restarts and really be partners in thinking about child well-being and doing that. It would be really awesome to see something similar come out from the mental health associations of how, to Roy's point, to help give a roadmap for local community providers of how they can engage and school districts can engage with them as well.
Sarah, did you have something to add there?
Yeah, so, I don't want to say that families are on their own, but I think it is important to acknowledge that, as you said, a lot of it is going to fall with them. And a lot of times when we think about disparities or not having enough resources, in the supply and demand, we think about trying to supply more mental health services, but there's also a piece that we can do in terms of decreasing the demand. And yes, it is a time of increased stress and increased trauma, but there are also things that families have within their control and in their power to be proactive that we know are protective for mental well-being. So simple things like sleep and movement and exercise, having quality time together. So these are things that are going to vary family to family in terms of how they look, but I don't want us to overlook what is completely in a family or a caregiver's control around things like turning in screens at 9 o'clock at night so the child's not up all night, because no one is at their best if they're not sleeping, right? So thinking about prevention and mental health promotion as a piece of this as well.
Yeah, I think this is a big question here. You mentioned earlier, Sarah, that the initial point of contact for so many things at school for kids, and mental health is one of them, as well as socialization, meals, etc. But mental health treatment, we know, can be highly effective. And it often gets sidelined in talking about mental health as a disorder or deficiency rather than educating people about mental health. Couple questions here. Lois from Statesboro wants to know how schools plan to include mental health education in curriculum. Will students learn about mental health this year? Lucretia from Macon, will counselors be able to host mental health wellness classes for students returning to school? I asked Sarah a little bit about that earlier. I didn't know if you wanted to follow up.
I'm not sure what schools are planning to do because it is so district dependent. But I do think this gets back to Erica and Roy's comment about the potential for partnership here. And that I think there are ways that even if the school counselors can't do this on top of everything else they're trying to manage, there may really be some opportunities to work with some providers in your community because they're going to understand also some of the cultural issues about that community. A lot of times when we say culture, people really mean race or ethnicity, but there's a culture to Waycross, Georgia that is different than the culture of Decatur. And so those local providers are going to have a sense of that local culture too.
I think it was Erica, I'm sorry, it was so long ago now, who said something about children craving stability. But an important life lesson, of course, is that change and adapting, that is the only constant. I think you referred to this earlier, Sarah. So part of education to be helping to build resilience. How could this crisis be discussed with children in a way that might reinforce those kind of skills for managing difficult transitions in life?
Well, we want to help them be resilient, but we also want to acknowledge the reality of what they're experiencing. So we want them to have the words to describe their feelings, and we also want to be validating. One of the things that has been interesting in just working with my patients over the past few weeks is how they are comforted by hearing that this is hard for everybody. And one of them even asked, well, is it hard for you? And I'm like, yes, it's hard for me too. And so we do want to give this, we do want to frame it as an opportunity in some ways, but we don't want to do that at the expense of acknowledging people's very real experiences and very real feelings that they're having. But one of the ways that we can think about resilience is helping people think about the ways where they do have agency, where they do have a choice, where what they are saying or doing does matter. So things like wearing their mask and helping everybody else stay safe, really framing it as this is you doing your part to help your classmates and your teachers, and having those conversations with kids.
We have just a couple of minutes left, so I want to ask all of you, and Sarah, if you're ready to go now, if you could decide how to best support mental health this year, what does that look like?
I would say it looks like getting to the basics. So really being intentional about coming together to make sure that families have safety, security, food, and shelter, and understanding that this is part of education, this is part of mental health. It's the foundation for everything when we're thinking about children's well-being.
Okay, minute to you, Roy.
Sure. So I would actually go back to something that Sarah said earlier, and we know this from primary care physical health, and it's true for primary care mental health too, is that there are things that we know that improve mood, improve energy, being physically active, getting sleep, eating well, being engaged in positive social interactions. We need to take what it is that we know that promotes wellness and positive health. We need to be listening to our kids. We need to give answers when we have them and acknowledge when we don't, make a commitment to finding answers for our students. And if we're working with families, doing that with our families. We need to, the thing I would leave is let's keep talking. Let's figure out what's working for whom and under what circumstances. And let's stop doing what's not working while we try to figure out how to do this better.
Eric, what does support look like for you in Georgia?
Everything my two colleagues, Sarah and Roy, just said, and creating an open, two-way dialogue with youth. And that is teachers and youth, that's parents and youth, leadership and youth, really hearing directly from them what they need. Because if we create safe spaces for them to be honest and open with what they're thinking and feeling, we as adults will do a much better job in meeting them where they are and getting their needs met.
I'm so grateful to my panelists and guests here, Dr. Erica Fenner-Sitkov, Executive Director of Voices for Georgia's Children, Dr. Sarah Vinson, founder of Loria Psych Group. She teaches psychiatry and pediatrics at Morehouse. She's a board member of NAMI Georgia, and Dr. Roy Reese, psychologist and director of the Smart and Secure Children Parent Leadership Program at Morehouse School of Medicine. We whizzed around a lot. I tried to get a lot of questions in, so I really, really appreciate all of your agility. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Supporting Mental Health, Our Georgia Schools Ready was co-produced by GPB and Call to Mind from American Public Media. This event was part of Well Beings. That's a national campaign with a focus on youth mental health created by public media station WETA. We do plan to air audio from this event on Second Thought this coming Friday at 11 Eastern. You can listen online, on air, or tell your tell your smart speaker to play GPB. And I do want to thank On Second Thought producer Priya Mahadevan and supervising producer Amelia Brock, engineers Jake Troyer and Jesse Neiswanger, and executive producer Mary Lynn Ryan. Special thanks today to Jade Abdul Malik and Emily Hackshaw at GPB, and to APM technical director Tom Campbell, Ellie Lyons for event support, and content manager Sam Chu from Call to Mind. I'm Virginia Prescott. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. We will be sending out a link for local and national resources, so please do keep an eye out for that. And if you want to get more involved with Well-Beings and share your thoughts on their story wall, here is more information.
The We Are Well-Beings story wall is a central part of the wellbeings.org website, social media platform, and the Well-Beings National Tour. We are asking the public of all ages to submit personal reflections, videos, photos, and short stories to offer hope, to foster understanding, to build community, and break down stigma.
What does being well mean to you? What is the one thing you wish people knew about mental health? What is your passion? What's your story?
Video can easily be submitted via social media using the hashtag #wellbeings or emailed to info@wellbeings.org.
Stories can also be submitted by uploading to Dropbox and live at Well-Beings Tour events. The We Are Well-Beings story wall is made possible through generous support provided by Well-Beings Youth Mental Health Project founding corporate sponsor Otska and Well-Beings media partner People.